Hello and welcome back to Anna Rose Reads the podcast. I am your host, Anna, and this week feels like a very special episode, if I'm being honest. For the first time, I believe, on this podcast, I read nonfiction horror, and it was written by Eleanor Johnson. She is a brilliant woman, and that is who I have the pleasure of sharing my conversation with today. We chat about the rise of horror in the late 1960s to the 1970s and beyond, kind of up to now, as it relates to feminism and equality in the United States. Um, some of the movies that Eleanor really does a deep dive in her book, like Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, The Stepford Wives, obviously align with a lot of histories, or American histories, I should say, turning points around reproductive health, women's rights, equal rights, all of these different things, domestic violence. And we talk about it. And it's not a super easy conversation to have whenever you're actively talking about your part of your identity not being equal to others and how that has been played out in the media and how that has been received. It's a really interesting thing that Eleanor has done with this book. I love it immensely, and I pray that everybody picks this one up and reads it. I think it's super enlightening and well written. I'm not the biggest fan of nonfiction, given how dry it can feel, but that is not something that this book suffers from. I cannot sing its praises enough, but hopefully my interview with Eleanor that you're about to hear will be an example of how much I enjoy this book and what Eleanor's doing. So I'm going to go ahead and stop ranting and raving now. I'm going to let the conversation play, and I'll catch up with you guys after. Hi, Eleanor. How are you?
Doing well. How are you doing?
I am doing very well. I am thrilled to be chatting with you. I read your book last week, Scream With Me. It's a nonfiction read, which normally I'm not a big nonfiction reader. Normally I'm just horror fiction all of the time. And so it was really refreshing to get to read a piece of nonfiction that had me really emotional, I'm going to be honest. And I,
Oh,
and I hope that our conversation conveys that.
yeah. Well, thanks for saying that. I'm very, very honored by that. I know it's a high bar for nonfiction for people who preferentially gravitate toward fiction. So thank you. And I too, if you were emotional reading it, I was very emotional writing it. I went through a lot of boxes of tissues in the researching of that book.
I can about imagine. So I want to go ahead and open up the space, though, for you to introduce yourself and let people know who you are, what you do, and what you're about.
Yeah, I'm Eleanor Johnson. I'm a literature professor, and my training is as a medievalist. So I've written books on medieval culture, medieval theology, medieval ecosystemic philosophy, so how medieval people felt about their position in the climate. But my newest book is Scream With Me, which looks at the relationship between 1970s horror films and the women's rights movement in the same time period, and then in the end, kind of telescopes forward to today.
Yeah, it is such an incredible read, and I'm not gonna lie, I was a little nervous picking it up because sometimes I feel like with nonfiction, especially tying it back to historical moments, sometimes it can feel like you're back in history class, but your writing was so exquisite and the way that you really intersperse the plots of the movies and the beats that are so relevant and tied it back to not only history of the past, but like today's history that's being made is so fluid. And so I just really had the best time reading it. And I have to ask how this book came to be. I know that you included in your, one of your opening chapters about, a lecture that you were giving, but if you want to give any more background about how the book came to be, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. I mean, writing every book is always different. Like my three scholarly books that preceded this were very different processes from this one. But this one, it started with a lecture. I was teaching this class at my university called The History of Horror. And that class actually isn't primarily about film. It's a 700-year survey of the horror genre, going back to Dante, because to me, as a medievalist, Dante's Inferno is like the first really significant self-aware work of horror in the Western canon. And it went forward to sort of Jordan Peele. So 700 years of horror, hooray, great times. And I was teaching the lecture on Rosemary's Baby. And I taught that film as being a parable about the dangers of denying women reproductive autonomy, which is a very strong reading of the film because sort of as soon as you start thinking about it in those terms, you can't unthink it. Like it's just right there, clearly what the film wants us to focus on. Because of course, Rosemary gets entrapped into this situation where she's drugged and impregnated by Satan with the help of her own husband who betrays her. And then she becomes pregnant with this baby who ends up being, of course, the Antichrist. So the film, which is based on a novel by Ira Levin, is really a thought experiment about what is the limit to which it's possible to take the pro-life argument. Because the pro-life argument is predicated usually, not always, but usually on Christian values and on the idea that a fetus is ensouled. But you cannot coherently, from any kind of Christian vantage point, root for Rosemary to keep her particular pregnancy because she's pregnant with the Antichrist. So rooting for her pregnancy to thrive is directly rooting against Jesus. So the film is designed as a thought experiment with sort of the question of what is the outer limit of being opposed to women having reproductive autonomy. So I taught the film in those terms to my undergraduate and graduate students, and I talked a lot about what the status of reproductive freedom was in New York State in the time period when the film was released, so in 1968. And in that year, for example, it was not legal for a woman to terminate a pregnancy even if it resulted from rape. And the New York State legislature was trying to liberalize abortion law about that exact issue in 67, 68. So when the film was being filmed and when the film was released, so that women who were rape victims would be allowed to terminate pregnancies that resulted from rape. So the film is not only asking kind of a really interesting theological question about what's the outer limit to which you can extend a pro-life position, it's also talking about what was happening in New York right then. Like, are we going to force women who are raped to carry those pregnancies to term? So I gave this lecture and it was a really good lecture. Sometimes when you give lectures, it's kind of like, okay, that was fine. I conveyed the material. Sometimes you give a lecture and you're like, oh, they were right with me. We were all choked up at the same points. We were laughing at the same points. That was that kind of lecture. It was like a very good lecture. The next day, the Supreme Court's decision to reverse Roe v. Wade was leaked. And so my students got all activated about what we had talked about. We had extra sessions. We were like meeting in cafes and talking about it. My students wrote incredible papers, a lot of them about that film. And I thought to myself, oh, like maybe I'll do something with this argument. And I had some time off. So I really leaned into it. And I realized that there was at minimum like a long form article that I could write. But the more I pushed on it, the book, it just evolved from being about Rosemary's Baby really to being about the whole genre of what I call domestic horror films in the late 60s and 70s in relation to the women's rights movement in the same time period. So, I had the Rosemary's Baby argument pretty well worked out. And from there, I sort of took a step back and I was like, well, if I think about other films from this period that are really taking an interesting angle on women's rights, what pops immediately to mind? And the next film that popped into my mind was The Exorcist, which is a film that might not strike a person as being particularly engaged with women's rights. But if you go back and rewatch that film with the sort of 1970s women's rights lens screwed to your glasses, you see it right away. Ellen Burstyn is a women's liber. And the film is like both kind of excited about how liberated she is. She's very sexy. She's very stylish. She swears a lot. She's like fun, but she's also kind of a ball buster, and a little bit intense. So, imagining my way back into the mindset of a 1970s filmgoer, I concluded that this character would have been someone who made audience members both excited and a little bit uncomfortable, right? Like she's a little bit too edgy
Yeah.
for the time period. And indeed, this demonic presence invades her home and her child and basically curbs her, brings her to heel, like disciplines her and breaks her. And as that happens over the course of The Exorcist, as this invading male demonic presence takes over her home and the body of her daughter, it also physically beats the hell out of her. And I realized like The Exorcist is a film about what was called wife battery in the 1970s, but what we now call domestic violence. And it was about it at a moment before a robust analytic vocabulary for describing that problem, the problem of domestic violence, really existed in the United States. Because the movement to end domestic battery really started like in 73, which is the same year that The Exorcist was released, very late in the year. And I realized, like, oh, maybe that film, which was on the silver screen for 2 years in the United States, crazy long
I
run, it's
know.
unbelievable now. People watched that thing obsessively, and they witnessed this like liberated woman get kind of disciplined and broken by this demon. And what was interesting to me about the film was that even though that, to summarize the narrative that way, it sounds really retrograde and kind of anti-feminist. But the film makes you want Chris to survive. It makes you want Chris and her daughter to escape. There's no sense that we're supposed to like the demon or approve of the demon's disciplining of her. So the film winds up landing as being a really sharp critique of those who think that it's their right to abuse the bodies of women and girls in the domestic sphere. So once I had that kind of argument gelling in my mind, I casted my mind out again. And the next film that I realized I wanted to write on was actually The Shining, which I write on later in the book. Uh, and that film is, very obviously about domestic abuse, and like people in the time period registered that it was about domestic abuse. So I kind of worked that up. And then I went and I thought, what else might belong here? Oh, like Ira Levin, who wrote Rosemary's Baby, also wrote another novel, The Stepford Wives. Let me read that. Lo and behold, The Stepford Wives is very, very engaged with the Equal Rights Amendment, which, everybody nowadays knows Roe v. Wade, whether you like it, whether you dislike it, people know it exists. The ERA is such a weird piece of legislation.
Yeah.
It's mattered so much in 1970s women's history, and it has mattered since then, but it's never passed. So it's this weird, like almost phantasmatic spectral presence in American law where American women have been repeatedly invited to believe that maybe our government would conclude that we are equal citizens and that we do deserve equal rights before the law. But that promise keeps getting like jerked away from us. And 1975 was like a kind of a fulcrum point in the initial attempt to pass the ERA, which started in kind of 72, 73. By 75, it started to look dicey, like maybe the ERA was in fact going to fail. And that was the release year of The Stepford Wives. So I did a reading of that film and the novel it's based on that was about how the film and the novel reflected on and critiqued the difficulty that the American public had in passing the ERA. And then from there, I thought, okay, well, what other films might I look at here? And I remembered that The Omen exists. And The Omen, for anyone who hasn't seen it, The Omen is not a direct reboot of Rosemary's Baby, but you'd have to have been asleep in the 1970s to not realize that it's reworking that same ground. And indeed, reviewers of the film of The Omen very explicitly associated it with Rosemary's Baby. So people did note that, right? Like it's another film in which a woman is made to, have and raise a child that's not a child she meant to have, right? And in the case of Rosemary, it's this rape baby. In the case of Kathy, the heroine of The Omen, she's raising a foundling child who is the child of Satan, but she believes the child to be her own. So that film too is based on a kind of reproductive coercion and a form of violence that's exercised by Kathy's husband against her. Although in that film, what's really fascinating is that Kathy's husband doesn't look anything like an abuser. He looks like this kind, loving, almost like doting,
Yeah.
fawning husband. But his core belief is that Kathy can't handle the truth. And the truth is that the baby she actually delivered died at birth, was killed at birth, it turns out. And he believes she can't tolerate that. So he just does this baby switch to sort of spare her the pain of grief. So he comes across to the viewer as like a nice guy. But the problem is that his nice guyism winds up getting Kathy killed by the Antichrist. So that film makes a really sophisticated critique of how domestic violence can occur, even like when committed by an ostensibly nice guy. And then the final movie I realized I wanted to write about, and the one that was the hardest to integrate was Alien.
Yeah.
Because Alien doesn't look like it's about violence in the domestic sphere, which is what all of the other films are about. Then I realized like the way that Ridley Scott kind of scripted and shot and executed the film, the crew members on the interstellar freighter, the Nostromo, they do function like a family. Dallas, the captain of the ship, very much functions as a father. The name of the computer in the ship is Mother. right? Not a coincidence.
Right.
And the other crew people function very much in kind of a sibling dynamic-y way. And then I realized, oh, this film is also part of this domestic horror genre that flourished in the 1970s. And in the case of Alien, the sort of legal touchstones for that film are, again, the Equal Rights Amendment and also legislation prohibiting rape and domestic violence, because that film is very, very tied up with critiques of rape and sexual violence in American culture.
Yeah, it's so insane to me. I'm a late bloomer to horror. I didn't really discover and get into horror until I was in, I would say, late teens, early 20s. So,
Mhm.
for me, I felt like I had a lot of homework to do whenever I got into it. It was like, okay, I need to go back and I need to watch this, this, and this. And the funny thing about horror is it has so much cultural prevalence, whether you
Yeah.
realize it or not. Like, we know the iconography behind The Shining. We know, it's just so well formed within, popular culture. We have formed opinions and we kind of know the plot before we ever watch these things, right?
Mhm.
And the really ironic thing is that I have been averse to every single one of these movies and these books because of how a lot of, like, in particular my mom is like, they just didn't treat women well back then.
Yeah.
The way, like the way that women are portrayed in those is really rough, and so like I never really had a problem going back and watching some of the later 80s horror films, the 90s slashers like Scream and all of that. Those are that felt like a little bit far removed, but when we got into the sphere that it felt like, it was really rough on women and I just didn't feel like I could handle it, and it's so fascinating to view these films and these stories through this lens of feminism because it's right there with the cultural context and the historical context. But for me, just at first blush, you're like, oh man, I don't know if I can handle it as a woman,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I wanted to convey with Scream With Me is that the films themselves, though they do take in some cases very strong feminist slants on topics like rape, domestic violence, reproductive autonomy, they are ambivalent about women, right? Like what I said
Yeah.
about The Exorcist, the Ellen Burstyn character, she does get disciplined by the film. Like it's not the case that The Exorcist is like, woo, women's
Right.
lib. The Exorcist is more like when women get liberated, shit goes sideways, right? And it's
Yeah.
bad and problematic. And maybe what allows the demon into her home is in part that she steps too far toward the direction of liberation. So these films they all have some form or another of ambivalence about the questions of women's rights. But what I think is so valuable about the films is that they raise the question. And in
Absolutely.
this case, they raise the question at a historical moment when the discourse in the public discourse was not sufficiently evolved. So like in every case, these films are posing questions that aren't really circulating like in news media in the way they're circulating in the films when the films come out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it too is just and you recognize this in the book, and that's one of the reasons that I really like this book is you present pretty much I don't want to say every argument, but a lot of arguments as to, hey, this is why this looks this way or feels this way, but here's the argument why or why not, and here's, the opposite. But again, that first blush feeling of these films being overly gratuitous with their violence against women and things like that, it does feel very empowering to take the stance and to look at it in this way of, no, we're actually calling attention to this. This is what, we're hoping to say. And you also bring up in the book is that it takes a while. It takes a minute to permeate socially what we're consuming.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, when I was reading, and I read a lot of reviews of the films that came out contemporaneous with the films being released, and it was so fascinating, right? Because by training, I'm a medievalist, and there is no archive of like what people thought about the Canterbury Tales when it first got written. Like you have to infer that based on how many times it got copied and whatever. But there are film reviews of all of these films, and like for example, with Rosemary's Baby, the reviews were crazy. Like there were reviews that were like, oh, it's a good spooky ride with witchy Satanist neighbors. And I'm here thinking like, that's not what this movie is about. The Satanist neighbors are incidental. The movie is about the fact that Rosemary's husband has no problem bawding her out against her will to Satan. Like he's the bad guy. The neighbors are like trivial. And then there were reviews that wanted to say that none of it was real and that Rosemary is actually crazy the entire time and there is no satanic plot. There were reviewers who thought that Rosemary was hysterical and that the rape hadn't happened. And that fried my mind, like, because there's
Yeah.
nothing in the movie to suggest that reading, right? It's not like we repeatedly see Rosemary slamming down pills of some kind in the bathroom, right? So I was fascinated by that. And then I found this one review by this reviewer named Kathleen Carroll. And Kathleen Carroll read the film the way that I experienced the film. She described Rosemary as a passive fawn and,
Yeah.
captured and like encircled by enemies all around. And I was like, so someone did see it that way in 1968. And not surprisingly, it was a female reviewer writing in a sea of male reviewers, right? So there's some indication that like it took a while, but it started happening almost from the beginning. And then over time, more and more people see this thing, and more people see this dynamic, and attitudes change, reproductive rights change, laws against domestic violence happily evolve it for the better. And so, these films, which were both reflective of the women's rights movement and accelerated the women's rights movement, they did, I think, contribute momentum there as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and like I said, just by the prevalence of within pop culture of our knowledge of these movies and the iconography, it's like it's hard to deny how impactful these pieces
Yeah.
of art are on us and what we do socially. I mean, that would be insane to say that it has no impact, right?
Yeah.
But speaking of impacts, and you brought up the research, and I hope this isn't too personal of a question, but you kind of already mentioned it. I mean, I had to imagine that researching for this was pretty rough because, when I picked it up, I was like, okay, I was expecting the beats of the horror plots to be pretty rough, sometimes like to revisit. But then when you start reading the history and you start reading about the setbacks and the arguments against equality, it's so frustrating for so many reasons. So I wanted to hear from you about your experience in taking on this project because I just can't imagine it would have been easy.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. And the archival research was painful. I'm glad I did it. Like all
Yeah.
the tears I shed are tears that I value and will continue to value. But, reading coverage, for example, in the New York Times of the effort to liberalize New York State's legislation against abortion, because in 67 and 68, you couldn't even get an abortion if you were a rape victim. And if you look at the arguments in the early side of that period, so sort of 66, 67, the arguments that show up in the press are like, a lot of women are dying from botched abortions. We shouldn't allow that to keep happening. And that's obviously true. And we don't want to go back to a world like that. I have to believe we don't want to go back to a world like that. The other arguments that get made at the early half of that period are that it's sort of unfair to doctors to put them in the position of maybe performing this procedure and then maybe doing jail time for it after. And I was like, what? I mean, like, I would feel bad for a doctor in that situation, but like, that's not my go-to when I think about the dynamics of reproductive autonomy.
There's no mortality involved in that one.
Yeah, right. Over the course of like 68, 69, the discourse starts to shift. And you start to see that like there are op-eds that use language like cruel and archaic laws. It's a matter to be discussed between a woman and her doctor, like more of the rhetoric we're familiar with now. And when you see that emerging and when you see the places where it emerges, because it doesn't always come from the like most, ostensibly left-leaning progressive side of the aisle. It comes from like the League of Synagogues or like a bunch of churches or like the American Medical Association, groups that are just sort of saying like, you know what, maybe we're not thinking about this right. And like random op-ed writers from the New York Times saying like, like there's a dehumanization element at work here. This is really a problem. When I started to see pro-liberalization articles that weren't thinking just about mortality and physicians' rights, but were thinking about what are we really saying when we tell women, no, you don't have autonomy over your body. I was like sobbing. Like I was
Yeah.
sitting at the computer typing with my face like actively wet from tears. And I'm just like typing and sobbing, typing and sobbing. And those were tears of happiness. Like I was pleased that people started thinking about women's subjective experience a little bit more rather than kind of thinking about just body count and physician detriment as the main motivators for liberalization. Then when I was researching the Exorcist chapter and I really got into case studies of domestic violence in the 1970s, that I had to take a lot of breaks from because, this country has a long way yet to go in terms of having adequate legal protection for primarily women and children in the domestic sphere. We're better about saying like, okay, gross physical battery is bad and should be illegal. But domestic violence has just evolved a lot in the last 50 years and takes on many, many different forms. For example, cyber stalking
Yep.
or financial abuse or, there's so many ways that abuse can happen in the home now, and the law hasn't caught up with most of those is reality. But in the 70s, there was nothing, right? And as a result, the case studies you read are horrifying.
Yeah.
Like I won't rehearse them because it's too brutal, honestly, but cases in which, women wind up dead or women wind up permanently deformed or permanently maimed or in which children get seriously injured in the process, and there just were not mechanisms by which women could extricate themselves from these situations easily. It's still very hard for survivors and victims of domestic violence to get out nowadays. But in the early 70s, there were like almost no shelters, domestic violence shelters in the entire country. Of those that did exist, it was hard to get places for kids. Um, it was like even in a very liberal, relatively liberal state like New York, one instance of severe battery was not even enough grounds to sue for divorce.
Hmm.
Forget about criminal prosecution. You couldn't get divorced if your husband beat the hell out of you once. It had to be a pattern of abuse, even to be grounds for divorce. That's, I think, a totally insane standard. And learning that stuff was hard, right? Like
Yeah.
learning how recent women's basic right to safety in the home is it was hard to learn. Later in the book, when I was reading about and thinking about marital rape as an element, marital rape wasn't criminalized in New York State until like 1983. That's within my lifetime, right? That's unbelievable. So learning these things about the recency of women having really any degree of safety in their home whatsoever that the law would back up, learning how recent that was excruciating. And then thinking about how in the last several years, many of those freedoms have been atrophying, that just put an extra sort of level of crystalline sharpness on the pain I already felt thinking about the 1970s. And I don't just mean the sort of reversal of Roe v. Wade, which, that's a very complicated issue. I have my views. Lots of other people have other views. I actually respect many different positions on that wide spectrum of what reproductive freedom should look like or entail. But like that isn't the only way in which women's rights in this country have been under siege. The whole movement to make women and children safer in the home has been atrophying as well. It's not getting as much press because it's like a sort of a thornier, more complex issue, but it's happening in that sphere too. And of course, the Equal Rights Amendment, I shouldn't laugh, but I mean, it's been up for approval a whole bunch of times, and we just cannot get it into the end zone. We just can't carry the ball all the way to the goal because I think in reality, there are too many Americans who, in their heart, are ambivalent about the question of whether women are equal. And
Yeah.
until that ambivalence gets expiated, and until more people will say in their heart, yes, women are equal, full citizens in the eyes of the law, we're going to have periods of regression like the one that we're in now, and like the one that people were trying to fight their way out of in the 1970s.
Yeah, I have done work with the domestic violence shelter before I went on to my master's program, and the I live
Yeah.
in Louisiana. I live in the South, like deep South. So the threshold by which, and I was hoping to assist put together the information needed to write, petitions for temporary restraining orders. And the threshold by which of information that we needed to bring to a judge to ask for this piece of paper, not even anything really all that consequential to be granted, was staggering to me. And that, as a young woman, just like it makes you feel defeated, right? And then you keep growing up and you keep growing older and you're thinking, oh, surely it's going to get better. And then here we are and you feel the regression and it's just so upsetting, and like you said, it's not even about, I don't think the Roe v. Wade of it all. It's the idea and the rhetoric that has been so widespread of the your body, my choice. Like you just want to vomit. You just want to throw up. I mean, and I think that, in your book, you do an excellent job of tapping into the give and take that we've had societally with, hey,
Hmm.
we're going to get really close to passing the ERA. And then, one of the things that surprised me the most, and I'm kind of curious if, you had any surprises in your research, but the fact of the women, the sheer number of women who were against it and spoke
Yeah.
out against it, that it's just like, I don't want to say that I didn't know because I knew, but it's another blow whenever you read it in this context, right?
Definitely. Yeah, that it was surprising to me how significant women were as drivers of
Yeah.
the ERA's failure. Phyllis Schlafly and her kind of cadre were instrumental in making sure that the ERA failed. The thing, and this is related to your question, the thing that surprised me most that I learned about the ERA was just how short it is
Yeah.
and how modest it is as a law. I always figured the text of the ERA must have been a mile long, enumerating the rights and privileges attendant upon full equality. And nope, no, it's like three clauses. They're all super short. And the reason that that matters, there's a fantastic scholar, Jane Mansbridge, who writes about this at length in her book, Why I think it's called Why We Lost the ERA. But she talks about how really what happened to the ERA is it went from being in the eyes of the American public, it transitioned from being a rights bill, which many Americans were totally fine with, to being a lifestyle bill. That the public perception was that this extremely modest bill, which would have changed almost nothing concrete about the day-to-day lives of American women, it got repackaged both by the right and like Phyllis Schlafly and her ilk and by the left as a bill that would have immediate lifestyle consequences. It would affect things like divorce law. It would affect things like women's eligibility for the draft. That was a big one that people didn't like, right? Nobody in this period wanted to think about their daughters dying in war, nor did they want to think about like female cadets being unable to like carry their male compatriots out of the fire range and combat zones. So this bill, which doesn't talk about any of that stuff, right? The bill is like women have equal rights before the law. This will be honored. It's very, very, very modest. The public perception was that the ERA would change women's fundamental role in society, and in particular, their role in the military and their role in the home. And people on the left were very excited about those things, and people on the right were in an absolute panic about those things. And in the end, the people on the right won because the ERA has still not passed. Bizarrely, most of the things that the people on the right were worried about, the ERA doing, have happened anyway.
Yep.
Like divorce law has changed in a way that the right hated. Women are, their role in the military is massively expanded in comparison to where it was in the mid 1970s, and still the ERA doesn't pass. So it's a very, now it's a symbolic thing. Now the fact that the ERA still hasn't passed, it is more of a white knuckle, let's like keep everybody in their lane kind of legal reality. And I look forward to the moment at which we get past that because I just would like to live in an America in which women are unambiguously seen as equal.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I have to say, like, I'm with you. Again, I also thought it was oh, there must be so much fine print. There must be so much, so many hypotheticals and questions that these people are having to work through. And I think almost in a way, though, given how straightforward it is and how applicable it is to so many things, is so frightening for those who are afraid of change. I don't want to say that I condone it. I guess I kind of understand it because people who are,
Yeah.
and as somebody from the South, people are very rooted in their traditions and their ways of life that, they don't really want to let go of. So I guess to me that feels a little bit more, understandable, but still I think, the opposition from women, fellow women is just really hard to stomach. It's one of the things that I really struggled with whenever I was reading the book. I was like, oh man, wherever we go, there we are, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that that is part of why art genres, film genres, literary genres, and particularly horror is such a potentially powerful medium for change because it doesn't come running at you and saying like, I am a political manifesto, like hear me and be changed, right? It says, oh, I'm a fiction. Witness me and be entertained. But en route to that goal, many different political positions can get sort of tried on and experimented with and explored. And I think, like watching The Stepford Wives, which is a film that's very much about the Equal Rights Amendment, I don't think anybody's happy that Joanna gets murdered and replaced by a robot at the end, right? So the film makes us sympathize with the idea that like maybe she should be allowed to have full personhood like everybody else.
Right. And you do a really great job. You know, we've been kind of talking about these movies of the past, but you also provide a lot of context for movies of our present with you kind of encompass the Paranormal Activity franchise, but mostly focusing on film one and then Creep and Creep
Yeah.
2, which I watched in college with friends
Mhm.
and never thought that deeply about. That was like a hangout movie that we just watched, get freaked out. And so
Yeah,
getting to hold it underneath the microscope
right.
like this was so cool to me. So just to talk a little bit about the modernness of those and the stance of the feminist stance that they take. I love what you have to say about Creep not preying on a woman
Mm.
and showing that men are just as vulnerable to the same things that we fear as women. I think it's such an interesting take. And did that hit you the first time that you watched those films, or was that something that you discovered later on?
A little bit of both. Like it did hit me the first time I watched it, and it's actually partially because of something you alluded to before when you were talking about like the iconographic status of those original six films and kind of like everybody knows about major scenes from The Shining. There's a scene early on in Creep where the videographer, main character, whose name is Aaron, happens to catch on film that there's like an axe embedded in a tree trunk in the lawn of the house of this man whose house he's gone to do a day of brave video making with him, and that all goes sideways. But that shot of the axe, I was like, oh, Shining reference. This is definitely going to be a domestic horror in some way. So they had like a sort of shot in the film that tipped their hand that like there was going to be some affiliation with The Shining. And of course, there is, just like in The Shining, the whole film is shot in a remote location where you're isolated in a mountain cabin with a crazy guy who's going to kill you with an axe. Right? So like that film is in part like a remake of The
Yeah.
Shining, except that it is all about men and not about women. And the other thing that kind of, I don't talk about this in the book at all, but that influenced my reading of that film, and this sort of draws on my training as like a scholar of medieval literature and someone who also teaches a lot of classical literature. There's a wonderful play by the Greek tragedian Sophocles called The Philoctetes. And it very rarely gets taught, but it's an amazing play. And I teach it as often as I can because it's like the only Greek tragedy that has no female characters. And I love to think about like how is Sophocles experimenting with how violence propagates itself in the absence of women? Like how does it work? How do men endanger each other and fight with each other and make peace with each other in the case of that play? So I already had that habit of mind to sort of think about how kind of like relentlessly homosocial films and works of art and works of drama, like those that only focus on male-male relationships, can actually say something about what's excluded, which is to say, the status of women. So I kind of brought that mentality to Creep. And so the kind of the intersection between the like, oh, Shining reference and the like, oh, interesting, a dramatic work that has no women. I bet this is about sexual violence on some level. That's kind of what initially triggered my reading of the film. But I also, the other thing that went on is as I think many people have, I've been stalked a few times in my life. And that film like made the hairs on my neck stand up in a really big way. Like I had to physically leave the room I was watching that movie in more than once during the film because I got so anxious. And I thought this film is getting something really right in how it's depicting male predatory behavior.
Yeah, it almost felt, I think, to me like the voyeurism of the video too, and in particular like our digital age, right? Like I said, I watched it in college, and you know, the videos that we have of other people in the public and that end up online, and like the world that that's exploded into. I mean, don't even get me started on that, but the voyeurism of that and the glee that comes from the puppetry of that is so. It just makes your skin crawl. I mean, there's no way
Yeah,
about
really powerful. And I guess like maybe the third or fourth time I watched that film, I don't want to blow the film for any of your audience members who mightn't have seen it, but in the end of the film, there's a scene where the bad guy looks at a collection of DVDs that he has. And it took me a few viewings to notice this, but I froze it on that frame. And I noticed that there's approximately an equal number of DVDs labeled with female names and labeled with male names. And I thought, someone in production like took the time to write those names on all those DVDs, this is obviously a deliberate signal that the psychology that produces violent stalking may seem to be about women, but it could pick off anyone because ultimately it's more about power and control
Yeah.
than anything else. And so the film is making a fascinating choice to tell us about stalking and violence and predation and murderous impulses directed at a man. And in that sense, Creep is really kind of in the same lineage as the Alien movie.
Hmm.
Because in the beginning of Alien, you see a male character played by John Hurt get raped and impregnated by an alien. Rape and impregnation are things that, particularly in 1979 when the film came out, were understood to happen only to women, right? But here's John Hurt raped and impregnated against his will. Creep is similar, right? Creep is talking about stalking and a kind of predatory violence that we think of as being heterosexual. It's not heterosexual. It can happen to anyone. Demographically, it's very common in heterosexual relationships. I don't want to minimize the relative level of risk that men and women are in from stalking, and women are in more risk. But it's not unheard of for
Yeah.
men, right? And I think the film really brilliantly leverages that and leverages our expectation that because the protagonist, Aaron, is like a big bear-like bro-y dude, that he's probably going to be fine. Not fine. Not fine.
Yeah, it
Does
works. So
that,
it's
yeah,
just one of those th it's like the yin and yang, right? They just work so well together because it escalates the horror in that way. Whenever nobody's safe, you feel, extra afraid because the
yeah,
reality is all of your safeguards are no longer in place.
right.
But it's also informing us socially and making us think about things that, maybe we weren't so readily thinking about. So I really have such a great appreciation for the little touches and even noticing the things like, hey, 50-50, these names are female and these are,
Yeah.
male. Things like that really go a long way.
Hmm.
And I kind of want to talk about how you end your book. To jump forward a little bit.
Yeah, please.
It's the part that got me, in tears. You pin a chapter, I guess, and kind of like a rally cry, I guess, to say, all of this is tough and all of this is hard, but it's so important that women keep writing, keep creating, keep speaking, keep doing, keep screaming, and all of these things. And it was probably just one of the best pieces of writing that I've read in a really long time that felt really empowering. And so I wanted to hear from you what this book means to you and all of its, the research work behind it, the emotionality, just everything. It's a big undertaking and a big project, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for saying that. I'm truly, truly honored by that. I will just share anecdotally that I read for the Audible book of Scream With Me.
Yeah.
I read like I forget what it was. It was like the introduction and the acknowledgments and the epilogue, which is that part.
Yeah.
I, wow, we had to do a lot of takes of the epilogue because I kept making myself cry. And they were like, it's okay, keep going. And then they'd be like, no, Eleanor, stop. That we can't actually tell what the words are that you're saying. So it's meant to kind of end with a little bit of a gut punch. And the reason for me is that, I am someone who, in I hope all aspects of my life, am generally guided by love.
Yeah.
I love people. I love this country with all its like warts and problems. I love being a New Yorker. My family's actually from the South, so I'm kind of a hybrid. I'm like a South Carolina, New York hybrid. I love America. I love my students. I love my colleagues. I love my friends. I love my fellow citizens. I love a lot of things. And I also think we are in an emergency of women's rights in this country. And I think if we ignore it, it will get worse. And I think it'll get worse fast. And I think it'll be hard to reverse course because too many people are quietly deciding to sign on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, women are not people, women should not have basic human rights, and that women's needs should be, if anything, demoted in their public importance. And I will not be party to that because among the things in the world that I love is women, all women, every kind of woman. I also love men. I love people. And I feel strongly that what horror does for us, and this was really important, and it's in the introduction of my book, horror allows us to practice empathic vulnerability, and in this case, with female protagonists. So these movies are hard to watch, right? They're hard to stomach, they're uncomfortable, but nobody watches Rosemary's Baby and thinks that Guy Woodhouse, the husband, is the cool one. he's awful, right? You'd have to be dead inside to think that Guy Woodhouse is the protagonist of that film. So these films, though they're horror, they're giving us a chance to practice empathic vulnerability, which I think is a precondition for social love, for loving other people, loving your neighbor, loving your friends, loving people across the aisle from you. So part of what I want in this movie is I want to hit people in their heart, not just in their fear, which like the films are doing in abundance. I don't want to scare people. The films are scaring people. I want to hit people in their heart. And I want to say like, you need to let yourself feel more. You need to feel more compassion and you need to tolerate your own vulnerability more and the vulnerability of other people and to care about the fact that the United States too, but the world is full of people who are acutely vulnerable and have no voice at all. That's been true throughout all of history. I can say that as a card-carrying medievalist. Okay. And it's true now, and it shouldn't be true now, right? We should be at a historical moment where vocalizing your reality is just something people can do, but we're not there. And the sad reality is we're not close. And
Yeah.
it's because we as a global culture are ambivalent about who gets to participate in the category of fully speaking human. I have a platform, which is that I'm an author and a scholar, so I can use my voice and I'm going to do it. And you have your platform and you're using your voice. And I think that's fucking great. And I hope you keep doing it. And I think anyone who's in the creative world or as a thought leader or as a thought follower, I don't care where you are in the hierarchy, if you have a way of using your voice, we're in an emergency and the time is now. And if you don't, if women's rights isn't your issue, go use your voice to advocate for somebody else because we are all in an emergency and it's serious. And I think that these films are a good way of waking people up to the emergent nature of the reality we're living in and to the importance of speaking out with vulnerability, empathy, and ultimately also love.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up everything I could not agree with more, and I swear I've tried to iterate that what you've just said so many times. But I think for me, you brought up a really interesting point in your book that, in the time that these movies were so pivotal, people were going to theaters together. You were going, it was a communal experience. And my degree is in psychology, it's not in sociology, but I do feel like, social media was really supposed to bring us together, but it's done nothing but tear us apart.
Yeah.
And so the fact that we're having these experience, some of it, sometimes we're having shared experiences, but I think more oftentimes than not, we're very isolated. And I think that
Mhm.
that's, through the way that technology has evolved, and it's really, really fucking frightening that that's,
Yeah.
the way the world turns now, and that's how we get to where we're at. So I think, like you said, the rally cry, the urge to keep create spaces where you can, try on different ideas and things like in horror to test out your
Mhm.
empathy. I mean, we talk in your book, you talk about how, you know, you learn more whenever you're in a heightened state of fear or, anxiety as you are with horror. You're
Mhm.
placing yourself more squarely in these people's shoes because,
Mhm.
you're in the same state and you're learning how to be more empathetic actively compared to, anything else. And I think that it's so important right now because we've never seen so much difference among one another than similarity.
Yeah.
So, I know horror's not for everybody, but I swear I have tried to articulate the things that you have articulated in this book so well, so many times for the
Thank
same
you.
reasons.
Yeah. Well, let's hope people listen.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna try and end on a little bit of a lighter note because that, it's a little heavy,
Yeah.
but
That's a
so I
heavy one.
want, yeah, so I want to ask, I know that you said that you kind of, you've taught this class on horror, going all the way from Dante to Jordan Peele. Do you read a lot of horror fiction, or are you mostly just kind of in the movie space, the bigger, horror fiction pieces? Like where does horror fiction now
I
fall for
do.
you?
I do. I read a lot of horror fiction. I actually have a book that's just about to be under contract, and I can't totally talk about it. But I have a different book that looks at horror literature over the course of the last 4,500 years
Oh,
straight.
incredible. Oh, put me down for that.
Massive mega survey. And it's a completely different kind of project from this one because this one is like we're going to look at one decade and then a little bit at right now. And the other book is like let's look at how this trope of horror, and it's a trope that has to do with demonizing women in a particular way. Let's
Yeah,
look at how this trope evolves from like ancient Mesopotamia to 2020.
that's
And so
incredible.
that's I've read a lot of horror in that project, like for that project, and I do have a Substack called eleanorshorrors.substack.com and or at eleanorshorrors.substack.com. And in it, I do a lot of film crit, but I also talk a lot about works of horror that I've read like Dante's Inferno from the Middle Ages, or like Macbeth. Shakespeare's Macbeth is a great horror play. It doesn't usually get
Yeah.
read that way, but it is. There's a character in Macbeth who goes, "Oh, horror, horror, horror." It's like Shakespeare's like, if anyone's confused about what I'm doing, it's this. Um, but actually, if I may, I recently read one of the best horror novels I've ever read, and I'm talking about it to anybody who will listen. And it's Stephen Graham Jones's new book, Buffalo Hunter Hunter.
Oh my God, don't even get me started on that one. It's so freaking good.
So good. I started reading that at 10 p.m., which I almost never start a book late at night. And I read it through. I like read that book until the wee hours in the morning. I was totally shot the next day, and I was like, whatever, it was worth it. So I think that's an excellent, excellent, excellent horror novel, like pinnacle vampire narrative. Like,
Yes.
I also really like Victor LaValle's The Changeling. I read
Yes,
that.
I still need to read that one. I read Lone Women by him and I love that one. But I need to read The Changeling still.
Yeah, excellent, excellent, excellent. And there's a number of other ones that like a person might not reflexively classify as horror, but that I would think of kind of like as horror. So for example, Rivka Galchen wrote a historical fiction called Everybody Knows Your Mother is a Witch. Um, it's excellent. It's a really interesting, imaginative exploration of the dynamics of the witch hunt period in Europe. It doesn't read like a horror, but the reality is that untold tens of thousands of human women were executed under false pretexts, right? And I had a student in a lecture once say, like, well, what about the women who were actually witches? And I had to be like, bro, none of them were actually witches, right? This was just a pretext for executing women, period, full stop. That's all it was. And a lot of people in the period knew that that's what it was, and it still happened. So
Yeah.
Rivka Olchin's book kind of explores those dynamics in a really interesting way. It's fascinating. Um, Other stuff I've read recently, to be honest, I've been reading a lot of really old stuff. So I've been reading
Yeah.
a lot of Mesopotamian myths about demons, stuff like that.
Well, I can't wait to see what the progression of what it started as and how it's, moved to now. I mean, I feel like we're in the middle of like a horror renaissance and we're in the
Yeah,
middle of so much happening within horror fiction. So I can't imagine what that looks like on such a, grand scale as you've been,
yeah.
examining.
It's a pretty interesting project, I have to say. I'll keep you posted.
Okay, good. I'm definitely going to subscribe to your Substack so I can keep track of what's going on. But yeah, no, I think that wraps up about all of my questions that I had for you about Scream with Me. I want to thank you for writing the book. I mean, it sounds very like simple and cliche, but like truly, I feel like it does a lot of work in a way that is so easy to lose yourself in. Like I found again, it's very rare for me to read nonfiction and like lose myself in a book. But that happened with Scream with Me, and I think it's just there's so many touchstones that make you angry, that might make you rethink things. There's so many things that this book just accomplishes, and I really applaud the amount of work that you put into it. And like I said, I know it could not have been easy, and we talked about that. Is there anything that we did not discuss that you wanted to mention or bring up? I know that you said that you mentioned that you're working on this book that might or might not be under contract, but any other projects for the rest of the year, anything like that?
I'm working on a few things right now. So I have this book that's going to come out probably in 2026. Um, I can't say any more about it because of where it's at in the whole process.
Yeah.
I'm trying to put the finishing touches on a book about the undead. So I refer to it fondly as my zombie book.
Yeah.
It's not just about zombies, it's about all forms of undeadness. So there's like vampire stuff in there.
Vampires, yeah.
And I'm writing a very short book about Dante's Inferno, and what really the nature of the horrific is in that work. So those are all my current projects at the moment.
Perfect. Well, that all of that sounds super, super fascinating to me. And like I said, I'm going to be staying tuned for whatever comes next from you. Again, thank you so much, honestly, for not only the intellect behind all this, but like the passion you can just see it, coming from your voice. So thank you so much for talking about Scream with me. It is on shelves on next week on September the 30th, from Atria Books. And thank you so much, Eleanor. This was an absolute treat. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure for me too. I loved your wonderful questions, and it was great to meet you and get to talk with you about horror.
Thank you. Another huge, huge thank you to Eleanor for her time and just sharing her intellect, her perspective on her research that she conducted for this book, her experiences in writing the book, and just being so personable, kind, and just, we go all the way from 1960 whatever to now. And I think that it's really cool that we're kind of trying to cover the horror gambit across U.S. history and how it impacts so many of us. And, in editing this, I listen back to my episodes, and it's equally upsetting that it's some hard things that we talk about between domestic violence and women's autonomy and things like that. But it is also incredibly empowering, and the fact that Eleanor has channeled this energy into you know screaming in a book about the things that matter most to her, and elevating others to do so. I think it's really, really important. So that's why I feel like today's episode is so special. It's just one that feels really socially prominent right now in my heart, and that's why this one feels a little different. So hopefully you all found the same, um, and hopefully it wasn't too heavy for you. Hopefully you still enjoyed yourself while you were listening. We are back to one episode a week being released now on the podcast. Sad times, I know, but your girl is tired, so she needs a break. Next week, I will be putting the schedule together. I will share next week's guest as soon as I have it all together. But a few names that you can look forward to. I just haven't quite finalized the order yet. Neil McRobert will be on to talk about his debut novel, or novella, I should say, Good Boy. Gemma Moore will be on to talk about her novel Itch, and so many other great authors. So be on the lookout for those episodes. Any announcements will always be made on my social media, and you can keep up with me, there for the most part. If any of you ever have any questions, feel free to email me or check out my website. Yeah, and as always, thank you all so, so much for listening, resharing, leaving reviews, everything else. It always just means a lot to me whenever that happens. So thank you all. I hope that you all have a lovely week, and until next week.